Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries.
It was a bright, crisp autumn morning when the group of 5 arrived at the Villisca X murder house. They had been planning the trip for months, ever since stumbling upon the story of the 1912 murders that had left the small Iowa town steeped in fear and mystery for over a century. Each of them had their own reasons for coming, but they all shared one thing in common: an insatiable curiosity for the unknown. Jack, the leader of the group, was a seasoned paranormal investigator with years of experience in haunted locations across the country. His calm demeanor and sharp instincts had made him a trusted figure in the ghost hunting community. Beside him was his best friend, Rachel, a journalist who had built a reputation on debunking supernatural claims. She was the group's skeptic, constantly searching for logical explanations behind the unexplainable. Then there was Luke, a quiet and introspective man who had once had an encounter with the paranormal that had left him shaken and searching for answers ever since. His pale blue eyes betrayed a sense of unease as he gazed at the house ahead, as if the old building was already whispering to him. Natalie, the group's tech expert, was responsible for setting up the cameras, recorders, and various devices they would use to monitor the house's activity. She had been fascinated with ghost stories since childhood, though her fascination often clashed with the practicalities of her work. Finally, there was Thomas, the youngest of the group, and an amateur historian with an obsessive interest in unsolved crimes. He had come to Villisca not just for the ghosts, but for the mystery that had baffled investigators for over a century. The murders, still unsolved after all these years, had left a trail of rumors, theories, and speculation, none of which had ever been proven. As they stood outside the house, its faded white exterior and weathered porch seemed almost ordinary, but they knew better. Behind those walls lay a darkness that had consumed 8 innocent lives one summer night in 1912. The murders of the Moore family and 2 young guests had left the town of Villisca scarred, and the house had never truly recovered from the horror that had occurred within it. Jack broke the silence as he approached the front door. "All right, we all know why we're here. Let's stay sharp, follow the plan, and make sure we document everything." His voice was steady, though his eyes held a flicker of anticipation. The group nodded in agreement, each feeling the weight of the moment as they crossed the threshold into the house. The air inside was still, almost too still, as if time itself had paused after that dreadful night in 1912. Dust coated the floorboards, and the furniture looked as though it had been untouched for decades, preserved in a grotesque tableau of a long-forgotten era. Their first night was meant to be routine, a simple setup of the equipment, some initial exploration, and a few baseline recordings to compare later. Jack had been in haunted houses before, but something about Villisca felt different. It wasn't just the murders, it was the lingering silence, the way the house seemed to watch them with an almost predatory patience. Rachel, as usual, was the first to voice her skepticism. "You know, there's probably a logical explanation for why this place has such a reputation," she said as she adjusted her camera. "Old houses like this make all sorts of noises, creaking wood, shifting foundations. People hear what they want to hear." Luke, standing by the staircase that led to the bedrooms where the murders had occurred, didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the steps, as though he could see the victim's last moments replaying in his mind. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but what about the people who come here and leave different? They can't all be imagining it." Jack shot a glance at Luke, sensing the unease in his voice. "That's why we're here," he said. "To find out what's really going on. But we stick to the facts, no jumping to conclusions." The group moved through the house methodically, each person taking their assigned area. Jack and Rachel set up cameras in the living room and kitchen, while Natalie positioned motion detectors in the hallways. Luke and Thomas took the upstairs bedrooms, where the murders had taken place. As they worked, the house seemed to breathe around them, the creaking of old wood and the occasional soft groan of the wind against the windows adding to the tension. Still, nothing out of the ordinary happened. No sudden noises, no inexplicable movements, just a quiet unease that hung in the air like a thick fog. It was around midnight when the first strange occurrence happened. Natalie, seated in the living room monitoring the video feeds, suddenly stiffened. Her eyes were locked on one of the screens showing the hallway upstairs. "Guys, come look at this," she called out, her voice low but urgent. Jack, Rachel, and Luke hurried over, crowding around the monitor. On the screen, they could see the empty hallway, dimly lit by the infrared camera. For a few moments, nothing happened, and they were about to dismiss it as a false alarm, when something moved, a shadow, just at the edge of the frame. "What the hell is that?" Luke muttered, leaning closer. The shadow was indistinct, more like a blur than a person, but it moved with purpose. It seemed to flicker, disappearing briefly before reappearing near the staircase. The group watched in tense silence as the shadow drifted down the stairs, vanishing into the darkness. "Could be a trick of the light," Rachel suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Jack frowned, his mind racing. He had seen shadows like this before in other haunted locations, but they had never felt as deliberate as this one. He reached for the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt and radioed Thomas, who was still upstairs. "Thomas, did you just walk through the hallway?" There was a long pause before Thomas's voice crackled through the speaker. "No. I'm in one of the bedrooms." "Why?" Jack exchanged a look with the others. "We saw something on the camera. A shadow. I need you to check the hallway." "Got it," Thomas replied. They watched on the monitor as Thomas stepped into the hallway, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He walked slowly, sweeping the light back and forth, but the shadow was gone. After a few minutes, he returned to the bedroom. "Nothing here," he reported. Natalie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Maybe it was just a glitch in the camera," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Jack wasn't ready to dismiss it. "Let's keep an eye on that hallway. If it happens again, we'll check it out in person." The group returned to their positions, but the unease in the air had thickened. They all felt it now, the sense that they were not alone in the house. As the night wore on, the tension only grew. Jack and Luke took turns walking through the house, checking the equipment and making sure everything was in order. But no matter where they went, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Around 2 a.m., Rachel, who had been reviewing some of the audio recordings, suddenly stopped and pulled off her headphones. Her face was pale, and her hands shook slightly as she turned to the others. "You guys need to hear this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She played the recording, and the group listened in silence. At first, it was just the usual ambient noise, the creaking of the house, the soft hum of the equipment. But then, faintly, they heard it. A voice. A child's voice. "Mommy." The word was barely audible, but it sent a chill down their spines. Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Play it again," he said. Rachel rewound the recording and played it once more. This time, they all heard it. The same voice, clearer now. "Mommy, help me." The group stared at each other, the weight of the words settling over them like a heavy blanket. There were no children in the house, and the voice had not been picked up by any of their cameras. Luke was the first to speak. "What the hell is going on?" When morning came, the sunlight, creeping through the dusty windows, brought little comfort to the group. The night had been long, restless, and filled with subtle, but deeply unsettling moments. No one had slept well. Even Rachel, usually the first to brush off such things as mere coincidence or trickery, couldn't shake the eerie feeling left by the child's voice on the recording. Jack was the first to speak after they gathered in the living room, seated around a makeshift breakfast of cold coffee and granola bars. He had dark circles under his eyes, his normally calm demeanor strained by the events of the previous night. "So, we heard the child's voice. What do we make of it?" he asked, glancing around the room. Natalie, who had been reviewing the footage again, spoke up. "I checked the equipment this morning. There were no issues with interference, no external sounds. Whatever we heard, it wasn't from outside." "That's impossible," Rachel said, though there was little conviction in her voice. "We know if there was a child nearby. Maybe someone's playing a prank on us?" Thomas shook his head. "There's no one else here. I walked the perimeter when I got up. This place is isolated. No neighbors for miles." Luke, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "We are dealing with something we can't explain. We all heard it. Ignoring it isn't going to make it go away." Jack nodded, his mind already churning with possibilities. He had come to the Villisca ex-murder house with a healthy dose of skepticism, but the evidence was beginning to mount. Still, he wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. They needed more proof, more data, and more time in the house. "We'll spend another night here," he decided. "Same setup as last night, but this time we'll rotate shifts. I don't want anyone alone in this house again." The group agreed, though the tension in the room was palpable. As they spent the rest of the day reviewing footage, reading up on the history of the house, and preparing for another night of investigation, the sense of dread only grew. By mid-afternoon, Rachel had dug deep into the archives of local newspapers and online forums dedicated to the Villisca murders. The more she read, the more disturbing the picture became. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime, the fact that 6 children and 2 adults had been savagely murdered in their sleep. It was the sheer number of unexplained incidents that had occurred in the house since then. There have been dozens of reports over the years, Rachel said, spreading out old clippings and articles across the table. People who stayed here claimed to hear voices, see shadows, even feel like they were being watched. A few have left with scratches, bruises. No one can explain it. Jack frowned, leaning over to inspect one of the articles. It detailed a family who had rented the house in the 1950s, only to leave in the middle of the night after hearing what they described as footsteps in the attic and whispers from the walls. They had never returned to Villisca. Luke, who had been studying one of the photos from the crime scene, looked up. And no one's ever figured out who did it. There were no suspects? Rachel shook her head. There were suspects. Lots of them, actually. A traveling preacher, a local businessman, even a couple of drifters. But none of the evidence ever stuck. It's like the murderer just vanished. Thomas, intrigued, leaned forward. And the town just moved on. No one found it strange that such a violent crime went unsolved. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. The town never really moved on. That's the thing. People who live here don't talk about it. They pretend it never happened. But there's always been this feeling around Villisca. Like the past never really went away. Jack absorbed this quietly, his mind racing with the implications. They were walking a fine line here. On one hand, the paranormal activity could be explained by the psychological weight of the unsolved murders. People came to the house expecting something strange, and so they experienced it. But on the other hand, there were too many coincidences, too many unexplained occurrences to ignore. As dusk fell, the group prepared for another long night in the house. The sky outside had turned a dark, bruised shade of purple, the wind picking up as if heralding a storm. The atmosphere inside the house felt even heavier than it had the night before, as if the very walls were bracing for something to come. This time, Jack assigned pairs to each area of the house. He and Rachel would monitor the cameras and audio equipment in the living room, while Luke and Natalie would take the upstairs bedrooms where the murders had occurred. Thomas, equipped with a handheld camera, would patrol the hallways and basement, checking for any signs of movement or disturbance. The first few hours passed quietly, the only sounds being the occasional creak of the old house settling and the wind howling outside. The group kept in constant contact through their walkie-talkies, but there was little to report, no strange noises, no shadows, no voices. It was almost too quiet. At around 1 a.m., just as Jack was about to suggest they rotate shifts, a sudden noise came from the upstairs bedrooms, a loud, metallic clanging sound that echoed through the house. What the hell was that? Rachel whispered, her hand frozen over the audio equipment. Jack grabbed his walkie-talkie. Luke, Natalie, what's going on up there? There was a long pause before Natalie's voice came through, shaky and uncertain. I don't know. We were sitting in the bedroom when the closet door just slammed open. And something fell. We can't see what it is. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Stay there. We're coming up. He and Rachel grabbed their flashlights and hurried upstairs. When they reached the bedroom, they found Luke and Natalie standing by the closet, their faces pale with confusion. The closet door was wide open, and at the foot of it, a large metal object lay on the floor, a rusted axe head, heavy and old. Rachel knelt down to inspect it. Where the hell did this come from? Natalie shook her head. It wasn't here before. We checked the closet earlier. There was nothing inside. Jack's mind raced. Could someone have planted the axe? But how? They had been monitoring the house all night, and no one had seen or heard anything until the door slammed open. Look, his voice low and tense, pointed to the axe head. Look at the handle. It's broken off. Like someone used it and then discarded it. Rachel stood up, her face grim. This is getting out of hand. First the voices, now this. What are we dealing with? Jack didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the axe head and examined it closely. The metal was cold, rough to the touch, but there was something unsettling about it. It felt like a relic, an artifact from the crime itself. But that wasn't possible, was it? Thomas, who had been patrolling the house with his camera, received a call about the axe, but continued his rounds. He was nearing the basement, a place he hadn't ventured into the night before. There was something about basements that always unnerved him, the cold, the darkness, the feeling of being cut off from the rest of the house. As he descended the stairs, flashlight in one hand and camera in the other, the air grew noticeably colder. His breath puffed out in small clouds as he reached the bottom step. The basement was dimly lit, with only a single exposed light bulb casting weak shadows across the concrete floor. Thomas moved carefully, scanning the room with his camera. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and tools, most of which looked like they hadn't been touched in years. He walked toward the far corner, where a large wooden trunk sat half-covered in dust. As he reached for the trunk's lid, his walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Thomas, you okay down there?" It was Jack's voice, steady but tense. "Yeah, I'm fine," Thomas replied, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "Just checking something out. I'll be back up in a minute." He set the camera down and lifted the lid of the trunk. Inside, he found a collection of old clothes, moth-eaten and yellowed with age. But as he rummaged through them, his hand brushed against something hard and cold. Frowning, he pushed the clothes aside to reveal a small, black leather-bound book. Thomas picked it up, his fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. It was too worn to make out any words, but as he flipped it open, he realized it wasn't just any book, it was a journal. The handwriting inside was messy, scrawled across the pages in ink that had bled and faded over time. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The air grew colder still, and for the first time, Thomas felt as though he wasn't alone in the basement. He closed the book quickly and grabbed his camera, hurrying back up the stairs. Whatever secrets the journal held, he wasn't ready to face them down there. Thomas sat in the living room, the journal resting on the table in front of him. The others had gathered around, their curiosity piqued by his discovery in the basement. The old leather-bound book seemed almost insignificant, but its presence carried an air of foreboding. "What is it?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas opened the journal again, careful not to damage the fragile pages. "It's a journal. Old. Very old. I found it buried under a pile of clothes in the basement. Jack, ever the skeptic, leaned in for a closer look. Do you think it belonged to someone connected to the murders? Possibly, Thomas replied, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, as though the person writing it had been in a state of constant agitation. It's hard to read. The ink has faded, and the handwriting is barely legible. Rachel pointed to a date scrawled at the top of one of the pages. Look. June 8, 1912. That's the day before the murders. Everyone fell silent. The connection to the night of the Villisca X murders was undeniable, but the journal itself raised more questions than answers. Who had written it? Why was it hidden in the basement? Natalie, who had been quiet since the incident with the ex-head, finally spoke up. Read it out loud. Maybe it'll give us some clues. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then began to read. June 8, 1912. The air feels heavy tonight, like something terrible is coming. I can feel it in my bones, the way a storm approaches before the first clap of thunder. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The shadows are growing darker, and the whispers in the walls are getting louder. They say it's just the wind, but I know better. The house is alive with something evil. Thomas paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the group. No one said a word, but the tension in the room was palpable. He continued reading. There are nights when I wake up and feel like I'm not alone in my own bed. The children say they've seen someone standing at the foot of their beds, watching them while they sleep. I told them it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I know they're telling the truth. There's something in this house with us. Luke shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This is getting weird. Who wrote this? Thomas shook his head. I don't know. It doesn't say. There's no name, no indication of who it might be. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes wide, with a mix of fascination and fear. Keep going. Thomas turned the page and continued reading. I've tried to leave, but every time I pack my things, something stops me. It's like the house won't let me go. The others think I'm crazy, but I can see it in their eyes, they're scared too. The walls are closing in, and I fear that whatever is in this house will soon make its move. Jack frowned, his skepticism wavering. This sounds like someone was losing their mind. Maybe the stress of living in that house was too much for them. Or, Luke countered, maybe they were onto something. The group decided to spend the rest of the day going through the journal, trying to decipher the scattered entries. As they pieced together the story, a chilling pattern emerged. The writer, whoever they had been, seemed to be spiraling into paranoia and fear. The journal spoke of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, voices whispering in the night, and a growing sense of dread that permeated the house. By the time they reached the final entry, dated the morning of June 10, 1912, the day the bodies had been discovered, the tension in the room was unbearable. It's too late now. I can hear them, the footsteps in the hallway, the soft creak of the floorboards. They're coming. I don't know if I'll survive the night, but if anyone finds this journal, know that it wasn't madness that took us. It was something far worse. Thomas closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. No one spoke for several moments, the weight of the words hanging in the air like a dense fog. Finally, Jack broke the silence. This doesn't prove anything. We still don't know who wrote it, or if it's even real. It could have been written by anyone, at any time. But it was hidden in the basement, Rachel argued. Why hide it unless there was something to hide? Luke, who had been pacing the room, stopped and turned to face the group. We need to figure out who wrote this journal. If we can trace it back to someone connected to the murders, maybe we'll get some answers. Natalie nodded. And we need to find out if there are any other records of people experiencing the same things we are. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right. We'll dig deeper into the history of the house, see if we can find any mention of the journal or the strange occurrences it describes. But we can't let this distract us from our main goal. We're here to document paranormal activity, not chase ghost stories. Despite his words, it was clear that the journal had shaken Jack's resolve. The evidence was mounting, and even he couldn't deny that something strange was happening in the Villisca X murder house. That night, the group split into shifts again, determined to keep a closer eye on the house. Jack and Thomas took the first watch, stationed in the living room, with the monitors and audio equipment. Luke and Natalie were assigned to the upstairs bedrooms, while Rachel patrolled the hallways and basement, her handheld camera at the ready. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards as the old structure settled in the cool night air. For hours, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Jack and Thomas sat in silence, their eyes glued to the monitors, while Luke and Natalie reported no unusual activity from upstairs. But just after midnight, a strange noise broke the silence. It was faint at first, like a low humming sound, but it gradually grew louder, reverberating through the walls of the house. "Do you hear that?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Yeah. But I can't tell where it's coming from." The two men listened intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as though the house was vibrating with some unseen energy. Before they could investigate further, Luke's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie. "Jack, are you hearing this? It's coming from all around us." "We hear it," Jack replied, his eyes scanning the monitors for any signs of movement. "Stay where you are. We're checking it out." He and Thomas grabbed their flashlights and headed into the hallway, the strange humming sound growing louder with each step. As they reached the base of the stairs, the sound suddenly stopped, plunging the house into an unsettling silence. "Where did it go?" Thomas whispered, his flashlight beam sweeping across the darkened hallway. Jack didn't answer, his mind racing with possibilities. Had the sound been some kind of electrical interference? Or was it something else entirely? Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of running footsteps. "Luke! Natalie!" Jack shouted, sprinting up the stairs with Thomas close behind. They burst into the bedroom to find Luke and Natalie standing by the closet, their faces pale with shock. The closet door had been ripped off its hinges, and the room was in disarray, as though a violent force had torn through it. "What happened?" Jack demanded, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of an intruder. "We don't know," Luke stammered, his voice shaking. 1 minute, everything was quiet. The next, the door flew off the closet and something, something unseen, started throwing things around the room. Natalie nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched her camera. I caught some of it on film, but I couldn't see what was doing it. Jack's mind raced. This was more than just strange noises or flickering lights. Something physical had happened. Something they couldn't explain. We need to get out of here, Thomas muttered, his voice low and tense. This is getting out of hand. Jack shook his head. Not yet. We need more evidence. The next morning, the group reconvened in the living room to review the footage from the previous night. The cameras had captured the strange humming sound, but it was faint, almost imperceptible, beneath the static. However, the footage from Natalie's handheld camera was much clearer. As they watched the events unfold on the screen, it became apparent that something had been moving in the room, something unseen. Objects flew across the room, the closet door was violently ripped from its hinges, and yet there was no visible source of the disturbance. This is insane, Rachel muttered, her eyes glued to the screen. How can something cause that much damage without being seen? Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. I don't know. But this is the kind of evidence we came here to find. Luke shook his head. Evidence of what, though? Poltergeist activity? A haunting? We still don't know what's causing this. Thomas flipped through the journal again, his eyes scanning the pages for any clues. There has to be something in here that explains it. The person who wrote this was experiencing the same things we are. Maybe they found a way to stop it. The group spent the rest of the day researching the history of the house, digging through old newspaper articles, town records, and any other information they could find. The more they uncovered, the darker the history of the house became. By the end of the day, they had pieced together a disturbing timeline of events. The Villisca X murders were just the beginning. Over the years, other families who had lived in the house had reported strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, voices whispering in the night, and a growing sense of dread that seemed to follow them wherever they went. But no one had ever connected these events to the journal. Until now. The final entry in the journal, written just hours before the murders, seemed to hold a key to the mystery. The shadows are closing in. I can feel them watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't know if I'll survive the night, but if anyone finds this journal, know that the house itself is to blame. It's alive, and it wants blood. Thomas closed the journal, his hands trembling. The words echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread. Could the house itself be responsible for the strange occurrences? Was it somehow feeding off the fear and anguish of those who lived within its walls? As night fell once again, the group prepared for another round of surveillance, but this time, they were on edge. The journal had given them a glimpse into the darkness that lurked within the house, but it had also raised more questions than answers. And as they settled into their positions for the night, each of them couldn't help but wonder if they would be the next victims of the Villisca X murders. The air in the house felt denser as the group gathered again in the living room. They had just reviewed the final entry in the mysterious journal, and though they had pieced together part of the puzzle, an ominous silence hung over them. Thomas hadn't slept. Neither had the others, though none of them admitted it outright. The incidents of the previous night, the vibrating walls, the closet door flying off its hinges, had left everyone too rattled to close their eyes for long. Their conversations became more clipped and tense. Luke was now openly skeptical, while Jack clung stubbornly to the idea that they were on the verge of uncovering something monumental. "We are missing something," Rachel said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet but insistent. "There's more to this." Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "We've searched the house. We've gone through the journals and the history. What more can there be?" "It's not about what we found," she replied, her gaze steady. "It's about what we haven't." Luke rolled his eyes, his frustration palpable. "Not this again. We've been chasing shadows for days. There's nothing else in this house except our own paranoia." Rachel didn't back down. "No. There's something else." The journal hinted at it. "The house feels wrong. I don't think it's just the history or the murders. Something else happened here." Thomas, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. "I think Rachel's right. We've been looking for answers in the wrong place." Jack looked at him, eyebrows raised. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking," Thomas continued. "We've been focusing on the murders themselves, the brutality of what happened. But what if the house is the key? We've seen things moving, heard things that can't be explained. The journal warned us, not about a killer, but about the house itself." Luke threw his hands up in frustration. "Here we go again. Haunted house theories." "No one said it's haunted," Rachel cut in, her voice sharp. "But something about this place isn't right." Determined to find answers, the group made a collective decision to dig deeper into the house's history. They split up again. Jack and Thomas combed through old town records, while Rachel and Natalie searched for personal testimonies from locals who had lived in Villisca at the time of the murders. As the hours stretched into the afternoon, they found themselves in the town's public library, poring over faded newspaper clippings and forgotten records. Thomas stumbled across something unusual: reports of previous inhabitants of the house before the infamous X murders. The files were disorganized and incomplete, but they reveal a disturbing trend. Over the decades, multiple families had left the house prematurely, all citing reasons that seemed vague at best. One clipping in particular stood out to Thomas. It was a brief article from 1899, detailing how a family had left the Villisca house after only 3 months, claiming to have been driven out by unseen forces. The article was short and dismissive, but it was enough to send a chill down Thomas's spine. When they regrouped at the house later that evening, Thomas shared his findings with the others. "This isn't the first time," he explained, laying the old clippings on the table. "This house has a history. Families have left before, and all of them mentioned something strange. Unseen forces, dark feelings, things moving. We are not the first ones to experience this." Rachel studied the clippings with growing unease. "How far back does this go?" "As far as I could find," Thomas replied. "Back to the late 1800s, maybe earlier. There's nothing concrete before that, but the pattern is clear. Something has been happening in this house for a long time." Natalie shivered. "So it's not just about the murders?" Thomas shook his head. "No. I think the murders were just the climax of something that had been building for years. The following night, the group decided to remain together instead of splitting up. They set up camp in the living room, surrounded by their equipment, determined to monitor every corner of the house in real time. Jack, still clinging to his belief in scientific explanations, insisted on capturing as much data as possible, while the others silently braced themselves for another night of unsettling experiences. As the night dragged on, the oppressive feeling in the house returned. Rachel was the first to notice it, the subtle shift in the air, the way the shadows seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. She glanced around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it just her imagination, or was the house watching them? Then the noises started. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. At first, it was faint, barely perceptible, but it gradually grew louder, echoing through the walls. The group froze, exchanging nervous glances. The tapping seemed to move around the house, starting in one corner of the room and then shifting to another. "What the hell is that?" Luke whispered, his bravado from earlier completely gone. Jack grabbed his camera, his hands shaking slightly. "I don't know. But we're going to find out." The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was making the noise was trying to get their attention. The group stood, flashlights in hand, and began to follow the sound. It led them to the basement. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with dampness and decay. The tapping had stopped as soon as they descended the stairs, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Thomas scanned the room with his flashlight, his beam illuminating the old stone walls and rotting beams. There was nothing unusual at first glance, just the same dusty, forgotten relics of the past they had seen before. But then Jack noticed something. A faint, barely visible outline on the floor. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt to reveal what appeared to be a trapdoor, its edges worn and splintered with age. "Guys," he whispered, "I think we just found something." Rachel knelt beside him, her eyes wide. "What is that?" Jack tugged at the edges of the trapdoor, and with a groaning creak, it opened. A narrow staircase descended into the darkness below, the air that rose from it even colder and more oppressive than the basement itself. "I don't like this," Natalie said, her voice trembling. "We have to see what's down there," Jack insisted. As the group descended into the unknown, the oppressive weight of the house seemed to intensify. Each step echoed in the confined space, the cold seeping into their bones. At the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves in a small, windowless room. At first, it seemed empty, just another forgotten part of the house's labyrinthine structure. But as they shone their flashlights around, they noticed something etched into the stone walls. Symbols. Strange, ancient markings that none of them recognized. Rachel reached out, tracing one of the symbols with her fingers. "What do you think these mean?" "I don't know," Thomas replied, his voice barely audible in the heavy silence. "But they don't look like anything I've ever seen." Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and a sense of dread washed over them all. Natalie clutched her arms, shivering uncontrollably. "We shouldn't be here." Before anyone could respond, the faint tapping sound returned, this time louder and more insistent. It wasn't coming from the walls this time, it was coming from beneath the floor. The tapping sound beneath the floor grew louder, reverberating through the small, dark space where the group now stood. They exchanged nervous glances, none of them daring to speak. Rachel was the first to move, her heart pounding in her chest as she knelt to inspect the floor. She ran her hands over the cold, rough stone, feeling for any sign of movement or loose tiles. The sound seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic drumming that felt more like a warning than anything else. Thomas crouched beside her, his flashlight beam flickering as he searched the ground for any hidden mechanism. The air in the room was stifling, the oppressive atmosphere tightening around them like a vice. "I think there's something under here," Rachel whispered, her fingers brushing against a crack in the stone. "Help me." Together, they began to pry at the loose tile, the cold stone resisting their efforts. But as they worked, the tapping grew more frantic, echoing up from the depths below. Sweat beaded on their foreheads as the tile finally gave way, revealing a small, dark hole just large enough for someone to slip through. "What is that?" Natalie asked, her voice trembling. Thomas shone his flashlight into the hole, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. It was as though the light was swallowed up by the void, leaving only shadows behind. "I don't know," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "But whatever it is, it's been sealed away for a long time." Against their better judgment, the group decided to explore the space below. They knew they were on the brink of uncovering something important, something that could finally explain the strange occurrences in the house. But as they descended into the blackness, the oppressive feeling of dread that had been building throughout their investigation only intensified. The tunnel was narrow and cramped, the air thick with dust and decay. The walls were rough and uneven, as though they had been carved out by hand. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on them from all sides. Rachel led the way, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead. The others followed close behind, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. They moved cautiously, their senses on high alert for any sign of danger. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached the end of the tunnel. The walls opened up into a small, circular chamber, its walls lined with strange, ancient symbols. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it rested a small, leather-bound book. The group gathered around the pedestal, their eyes fixed on the book. It looked old, far older than anything else they had found in the house. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Rachel reached out to touch it, but hesitated. Something about the book felt wrong. As though it held the answers they had been seeking, but at a terrible cost. "We came this far," Jack said, breaking the silence. "We need to know." With a deep breath, Rachel opened the book. The pages were filled with dense, cramped handwriting, written in a language none of them recognized. But as they flipped through the journal, they began to understand. It wasn't just a record of the house's history, it was a chronicle of the darkness that had taken root here long before the murders. The journal spoke of rituals, of sacrifices made in the name of some ancient, malevolent force. It described how the house had been built on land cursed long ago, a place where terrible things had happened, and where terrible things would continue to happen as long as the house stood. The murders in 1912 were not an isolated incident. They were just the latest in a long line of tragedies that had plagued the house for centuries. The journal suggested that the spirits of the victims were trapped here, bound to the house by the darkness that had claimed their lives. But it also hinted at something worse, something that still lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they read, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the oppressive feeling of dread that had followed them since they entered the house became almost unbearable. "We need to get out of here," Natalie whispered, her voice shaking. But as they turned to leave, the entrance to the tunnel collapsed behind them. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The walls seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing down on their minds like a weight. The only way out was through the house, through whatever force had been haunting them since the moment they arrived. Thomas took charge, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his chest. "We have to keep moving. There has to be another way out." They searched the chamber for any sign of an exit, their flashlights flickering as the darkness seemed to grow stronger. The strange symbols on the walls seemed to write and shift in the dim light, as though they were alive. And then the tapping returned. It was louder now, more insistent, echoing through the chamber like the beating of a drum. The sound seemed to come from all around them, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The walls shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling as the house itself seemed to awaken. "We need to move, now!" Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the shaking earth. They ran, stumbling through the darkness, their flashlights flickering as they searched for a way out. But no matter where they turned, the tapping followed them, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The group froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. But they weren't alone. As they stood in the darkness, something moved in the shadows. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement at the edge of their vision. But as they turned their flashlights towards it, they saw the outline of a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face hidden in the shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching them. Thomas stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step closer, its movement slow and deliberate. Rachel grabbed Thomas's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to go." But there was nowhere to go. The entrance was blocked, and the figure was between them and the only way out. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as the figure approached. The group backed away, their hearts racing as they realized they were cornered. And then, just as the figure reached them, it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The tapping stopped, the shaking ceased, and the oppressive feeling of dread lifted, if only for a moment. But then the figure spoke, its voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't have come here." With those words, the ground beneath them gave way, and the group fell into the darkness below.